Alright, let's go. Number 10. The faulty heat shield. On December 11th, 2022, the Orion spacecraft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean after a 25-day journey around the moon. Recovery teams pulled the capsule from the water, and for a brief triumphant moment, it looked like NASA had pulled off something extraordinary. Artemis 1 had worked. The cameras rolled, the officials smiled, and the world moved on. But when engineers began the quiet, unglamorous work of inspecting the heat shield up close, they found something that wiped the smiles away. The Orion heat shield is made of abcoat, an ablative material with direct heritage from the Apollo program. Ablative shielding works by design. It is supposed to char, burn, and slowly erode away during re-entry, carrying heat energy with it rather than letting it reach the crew cabin. Engineers had modeled exactly how this process would unfold. They had run simulations, reviewed the physics, and certified the material for the task. What they had not modeled, because they had no reason to, was what actually happened. Chunks of avcoat had broken away from the heat shield in a pattern that nobody expected. This was not controlled ablation. This was material loss that fell outside the predicted behavior of the system, occurring at re-entry temperatures approaching 2,760 degrees Celsius, roughly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that turns rock to vapor. The anomaly was invisible during the mission itself. No alarm sounded. No sensor flagged it in real time. It was only discovered afterward in the cold light of post-flight analysis when it was already too late to change anything. NASA acknowledged the problem publicly in 2023 and cited it as one of the factors contributing to the delay of Artemis 2 beyond its original late 2024 target. Engineers launched an investigation reviewing manufacturing processes, material batches, and thermal models. What they have not done, at least not in any public statement, is confirm that they fully understand why the material behaved the way it did, or guarantee that the heat shield already manufactured for the Artemis 2 Orion capsule will not do the same thing. The investigation produced findings. Whether those findings produce certainty is a different question entirely. If the same unexplained erosion occurs during the Artemis 2 re-entry, there will be 4 human beings sitting approximately 30 centimeters behind that shield, separated from 2,760 degree plasma by a material that has already surprised the engineers who built it. The Artemis program opened its crude era by discovering that its most critical passive safety system behaved in ways nobody predicted. That is not a rumor or a conspiracy or speculation. It is the documented starting point for everything that follows. Number 9. The oxygen system that raised questions. In the months following the Artemis 1 splashdown, as NASA's engineers worked through the long, methodical process of post-flight review, certain findings stayed inside the agency. Some were technical details too granular for press releases. Others were system-level concerns that fed directly into the planning for a crewed mission. Among the areas quietly flagged for review was Orion's Environmental Control and Life Support System, the ECLSS, the integrated network of hardware and software responsible for managing the cabin atmosphere aboard a spacecraft carrying human beings. The ECLSS performs functions that sound almost mundanely mechanical until you remember what happens without them. It regulates oxygen supply. It removes carbon dioxide before it reaches toxic concentrations. It manages cabin pressure within the narrow band that keeps a human body functional. On the International Space Station, these systems operate with redundancy, built upon redundancy, crews trained to respond to failures, and a rescue vehicle docked at the airlock. On Orion, traveling up to 400,000 kilometers from Earth with 4 people aboard for approximately 10 days, the margins look different. During the Artemis 1 mission, sensors recorded anomalous readings within the cabin atmosphere management portion of the ECLSS. Aerospace journalists and program observers noted that NASA's public communications addressed the anomaly only in the broadest terms, describing it as something being assessed, rather than something understood and resolved. The specific nature of the pressure behavior that triggered concern has not been detailed in any public statement from the agency. The gap between what happened and what has been explained to the outside world remains open. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen have trained for years to fly this mission. They are among the most capable human beings on Earth, selected through processes of extraordinary rigor, prepared for scenarios most people cannot imagine. What they cannot do is troubleshoot an atmosphere system failure that ground teams don't fully understand in deep space with no rescue option and a dwindling oxygen supply. NASA classifies life support failures under its own risk framework as catastrophic events, the highest severity category the agency uses, meaning failures that result in loss of crew. On June 30th, 1971, the Soyuz 11 cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev died because a ventilation valve 12 millimeters in diameter opened at the wrong moment. the cabin depressurized in 112 seconds. The recovery team found them sitting perfectly in their seats, restraints fastened, with no outward sign of what had happened. An atmospheric anomaly that NASA has not fully explained to the public is sitting in the same risk category as the fault that killed those 3 men. The hardware is different, the physics is not. Number 8. The 30 minutes of silence. On the far side of the moon, there is no signal. Not a weak signal, or a degraded signal, or a signal that requires a more powerful antenna to receive. There's nothing. Because the moon itself sits between the spacecraft and every radio telescope, every ground station, every antenna dish in NASA's deep space network, and every human being on Earth. This is a fundamental constraint of physics, and it has been known since the first lunar missions. It has never stopped being terrifying. Artemis 2 will follow a free return trajectory, a carefully calculated path that swings the Orion spacecraft around the far side of the moon and uses lunar gravity to slingshot it back toward Earth without requiring a major engine burn. This trajectory will carry the crew to approximately 8,889 kilometers beyond the lunar far side, making them the farthest human beings from Earth in the history of spaceflight, surpassing the distance record set by the Apollo 13 crew in April 1970. It is on paper an elegant and efficient mission profile. It is also the profile during which the crew will be completely unreachable for approximately 30 minutes. During that window, mission control in Houston goes dark. Flight controllers will be able to see no telemetry from the spacecraft. They will receive no data on cabin pressure, thermal performance, propulsion status, computer health, or crew condition. If a system fails during those 30 minutes, the 4 astronauts aboard must diagnose it, respond to it, and manage it entirely on their own, with no guidance from the thousands of engineers on the ground who designed the vehicle. The Orion and its European service module represent a spacecraft stack with no crewed flight heritage whatsoever. No human crew has ever operated this specific combination of hardware in space under any conditions. The last time human beings lost contact with Earth during a far-side lunar transit was December 1972, when the Apollo 17 crew passed behind the moon in a spacecraft that had been flown, crewed, and iteratively tested across 11 previous Apollo missions. The Orion has flown once, uncrewed, and that single flight produced the heat shield anomaly, the atmospheric system questions, the computer resets, and multiple other findings that are still being worked through. The depth of experience behind Apollo 17's far-side passage and the depth of experience behind Artemis 2's far-side passage are not comparable things. For roughly 30 minutes, 4 people will exist in a state of complete isolation at a distance no human being has ever survived before in a vehicle that has never carried a human crew. Mission control will sit in silence, watching a countdown clock, waiting for the signal to return. It usually does. The history of spaceflight contains the cases when it didn't, and those cases share a common feature. The silence, when it ended, revealed something that could no longer be fixed. Number 7. The invisible storm. Space does not look dangerous. From the windows of the Orion capsule, it is darkness and stars, and the extraordinary visual silence of a universe that does not care whether you are there. But passing through that silence, in all directions at all times, is a constant rain of high-energy particles. Atomic nuclei accelerated to near the speed of light by the most violent processes in the galaxy. Cosmic rays originating from supernova, from black holes, from sources billions of light years away. They pass through spacecraft walls as though the walls are not there. They pass through human tissue the same way, ionizing cells, breaking DNA strands, and accumulating biological damage that has no immediate symptom and no immediate cure. On Earth, the planet's magnetic field deflects most of this radiation. The Van Allen belts, which extend to approximately 58,000 kilometers from Earth's surface, trap charged particles in 2 enormous donut-shaped regions around the planet. Inside low Earth orbit, astronauts on the International Space Station receive elevated but manageable radiation doses. Beyond the Van Allen belts, in the deep space environment where Artemis 2 will operate, that protection disappears entirely. NASA revised its career radiation exposure limits for astronauts in 2021, setting a unified lifetime cap of 600 millisieverts regardless of age or sex, a figure designed to limit excess cancer risk. The deep space environment will be drawing against that limit for the entire duration of the Artemis 2 mission. The galactic cosmic ray background is a chronic hazard, measurable and somewhat predictable. The acute hazard is something different, a solar particle event, a sudden, intense eruption from the sun that can accelerate protons to enormous energies and flood the inner solar system with radiation in a matter of hours. A major SPE can deliver a potentially lethal dose of radiation to an unshielded human being in deep space faster than a return trajectory to Earth can be executed. Orion's walls provide partial shielding. There is no dedicated radiation shelter aboard the spacecraft capable of protecting the crew from a major event. The crew cannot shelter in a thicker-walled compartment because no such compartment exists. The timing of Artemis II places the mission near the peak of solar cycle 25. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and NASA's Space Weather Prediction Center have both confirmed that solar cycle 25 is tracking at or above predicted intensity, with solar maximum expected around 2025. A mission into deep space near solar maximum carries elevated solar particle event probability. NASA monitors solar activity continuously and can issue warnings. What NASA cannot do is guarantee that a major flare will give sufficient warning before the radiation front arrives, or that the trajectory at that moment would allow a rapid return to Earth's protective magnetic field. NASA has been transparent about the radiation risk for Artemis missions. The agency discusses it openly in mission planning documents and researcher briefings. That transparency is admirable, and it does not change the underlying physics. The crew's primary protection against a major solar particle event is the statistical probability that one will not occur during their specific mission window, and the hope that the sun, which has been more active than models predicted throughout this cycle, continues to cooperate. Hope is not an engineering control. It is what remains when engineering controls run out. Number 6. The engine with one chance. The European service module is a cylinder of aluminium, propellant tanks, and precision engineering attached to the base of the Orion crew capsule. It is the product of a collaboration between the European Space Agency and Airbus Defence and Space, representing Europe's largest contribution to human spaceflight since the Columbus Laboratory module on the International Space Station. It provides Orion with its power, its water, its oxygen storage, and most critically, its propulsion. Without the ESM's main engine firing correctly at the right moment and for the right duration, the Artemis II crew does not come home. The ESM's primary propulsion comes from an AJ-10 engine, a heritage design with deep roots in American spaceflight history, the same engine family used on the Space Shuttle's orbital maneuvering system. Heritage is often reassuring in spaceflight. Proven hardware, the logic goes, is reliable hardware. But the AJ-10 in the ESM operates in a new configuration, attached to a new vehicle, integrated with new software and new propellant feed systems, and it must perform flawlessly during burns that cannot be repeated or reattempted if something goes wrong. The translunar injection burn sends the crew to the moon. The return burn brings them home. There is no backup main engine. The ESM's AJ-10 is the only one there is. During the Artemis I mission, engineers identified anomalous behavior in 8 of the ESM's 24 auxiliary thrusters, smaller propulsion units used for attitude control and orbital adjustments. The thrusters did not perform entirely within their predicted parameters. NASA and ESA acknowledged the anomalies and began investigating. Post-flight reviews examined the root cause. And the findings fed into preparations for the Artemis II ESM, the second unit of its kind ever built. What has not been confirmed in any public statement is that the root cause was definitively identified and fully corrected before the Artemis II module was manufactured and delivered to Kennedy Space Center. The distinction between a thruster anomaly on an uncrewed mission and the same anomaly on a crewed mission is not just a matter of severity, it is a matter of what happens next. During Artemis I, when a thruster behaved unexpectedly, engineers had time. They had communication access to the vehicle. They had the luxury of analysis without consequence. In deep space, 400,000 kilometers from Earth, with 4 people aboard, an unexpected propulsion anomaly during a critical burn has a different character entirely. The options narrow fast. The timeline compresses. The margin for error, which was already thin, may not exist at all. If the AJ-10 engine performs outside its predicted parameters during the return burn, there is no contingency. That ends well. The crew cannot call for a tow. They cannot wait for a rescue mission that would take days to assemble and launch, even if one existed, which it doesn't. The engine that must fire to bring Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen back to Earth has never fired with human lives depending on it. It has flown once, uncrewed, and during that flight, the propulsion system produced results that engineers are still working to fully explain. Number 5. The suit between life and nothing. The Orion Crew Survival System suit is not a glamorous piece of hardware. It will not be on any mission poster. It is not the sleek white Axiom suit the crew will wear for lunar surface operations and future Artemis missions. The OCSS is an orange pressurized survival suit, worn during launch, re-entry, and any emergency scenario in which the crew needs protection from a rapid cabin depressurization. It is, in the most literal sense, the last physical barrier between 4 astronauts and the vacuum of space during the most dangerous phases of the mission, and it is a modification of a design that first flew on the space shuttle. The Advanced Crew Escape Suit, the ACES, was introduced after the Challenger disaster as part of a broader program of safety improvements, giving shuttle crews the ability to survive a bailout scenario during the glide phase of re-entry. The OCSS for Artemis is derived from that lineage, updated for Orion's specific configuration and mission profile. Heritage hardware again carries the weight of experience. It also carries the limitations of age, and the reality that modifications to a legacy design can introduce integration challenges that a clean sheet design would not have inherited. During fit checks, pressurization testing, and crew training simulations conducted in the lead-up to Artemis II, engineers and mission planners identified concerns with suit pressurization interfaces and visor sealing performance on specific crew members. Christina Koch, who will become the first woman to travel beyond low Earth orbit in history, represented a specific engineering challenge in suit fit, a challenge that is not unique to her or to Artemis. NASA has a documented history of suit sizing problems affecting female astronauts. The planned first all-female spacewalk on the International Space Station in March 2019 was scrubbed, in part because a medium-sized suit torso was not available for Anne McLean. The agency has been working on this issue for years. Working on an issue is not the same as resolving it. In July 2013, European Space Agency astronaut Luca Parmitano was conducting a routine spacewalk outside the International Space Station when water began accumulating inside his helmet, originating from a fault in the suit's water separator system. The water rose to cover his eyes, his nose, and eventually his ears, leaving him temporarily blinded and unable to communicate clearly while floating in the vacuum of space. He survived because his crewmates reached him in time, and he was able to navigate back to the airlock from memory. The suit had been checked. The suit had been certified. The suit had a fault that nobody had anticipated until it was trying to drown a man in his own helmet. A pressurization failure in the OCSS during Artemis II's re-entry at hypersonic velocity, surrounded by plasma at 2,760 degrees Celsius, would be fatal within seconds. There would be no time for a crewmate to intervene. There would be no airlock to retreat to. There would be no second chance. The suit is the last line of defense, and the concerns identified during pre-flight testing have not been fully addressed in any public NASA statement. The world's most capable astronauts will be wearing a modified 50-year-old design through the most dangerous minutes of their lives, and the agency that built it has not told us whether all of the questions it raised have been answered. Number 4. The rocket that cannot be stopped. On August 29, 2022, the Space Launch System stood on Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center and refused to fly. A sensor reading on Engine 3 indicated that the RS-25 engine had not reached the required preconditioning temperature range, and the launch was scrubbed. It was a conservative, correct decision, exactly the kind of data-driven caution that the post-Columbia NASA had worked hard to rebuild. 5 days later, the second attempt was halted by a liquid hydrogen leak at the quick disconnect interface, the point where propellant lines connect to the rocket before detaching at liftoff. The SLS finally launched on November 16, 2022, and it flew. But it did not fly cleanly, and the surprises it delivered did not stop when the mission ended. Post-flight analysis of the Artemis I launch data revealed that a hydraulic actuator on one of the 2 solid rocket boosters had operated outside its predicted performance range during ascent. The solid rocket boosters are the 2 enormous white cylinders flanking the core stage of the SLS, each producing approximately 3.6 million pounds of thrust, together providing the majority of the vehicle's liftoff power. They cannot be throttled. They cannot be shut down. Once they ignite, they will burn for approximately 2 minutes and 8 seconds regardless of anything else that happens. There is no off switch. There is no abort from the pad. The crew is committed to that ride the moment the boosters light, and during Artemis I, one of the boosters was doing something engineers had not predicted. The RS-25 engines powering the SLS core stage are not new hardware. They are Heritage Space Shuttle main engines, retired from the shuttle fleet and modified for SLS use. NASA is operating them at higher thrust levels than they ever flew at during the shuttle program, pushing them to 109% of their rated power level, a setting that extracts more performance but also places greater thermal and mechanical stress on aging hardware. There are a finite number of RS-25 engines in existence. They cannot currently be replaced with new builds in meaningful quantity, because the original production line no longer exists in its shuttle-era form. Each engine that flies is one that cannot easily be replaced. The launch abort system sits at the tip of the Orion stack, a tower of solid fuel motors capable of pulling the crew capsule away from a failing rocket at enormous speed. It is a genuine safety advance, a real capability that did not exist during the shuttle era. But the LAS operates within physical constraints that no engineering can eliminate. At certain combinations of altitude and velocity during ascent, the aerodynamic and inertial forces involved mean that successful crew separation cannot be guaranteed even if the system fires correctly. The LA's tower jettisons from the vehicle approximately 3 minutes into flight. After that point, the crew has no escape mechanism at all. During the first 2 minutes and 8 seconds of every SLS launch, with the boosters burning and the abort system at the limits of its operational envelope, the Artemis II crew sits atop approximately 2.7 million kilograms of propellant in a rocket whose last flight produced data anomalies that have not been satisfactorily explained in public. The window of complete helplessness at the opening of every mission is a known, accepted, engineered-around constraint of chemical rocketry. What is not known, and not publicly explained, is how the anomalies documented during Artemis interact with the risk calculations for the crew who will sit in that same position next. Number 3. The abort system that has a limit. Every crewed launch vehicle in history has contained a window of unsurvivability, a period during ascent when the forces involved, the velocity, the altitude, the trajectory, and the proximity to an exploding rocket exceed what any escape system can overcome. NASA's engineers know exactly when that window opens on the SLS. They know exactly when it closes. They have calculated the boundaries with precision, run them through probabilistic models, and arrived at risk numbers that the agency treats as acceptable. The existence of that window is not a secret. The details of what fills it are another matter. Orion's launch abort system is a genuine engineering achievement. The abort motor produces approximately 400,000 pounds of thrust, firing in milliseconds to pull the crew capsule clear of a failing rocket at accelerations approaching 15 G. It operates across most of the ascent profile, giving the crew a meaningful escape option during the first phase of the SLS flight. NASA tested it extensively, including a successful max dynamic pressure abort test in July 2019 that demonstrated the system's capability under the most stressful aerodynamic conditions of ascent. The technology works. The physics, however, has boundaries that technology cannot negotiate away. As the SLS accelerates through the upper atmosphere and into space, there is a period roughly above 91,000 feet and approaching hypersonic velocity, where the combination of altitude, speed, and trajectory creates conditions under which the LAS cannot guarantee successful separation and stabilization of the crew capsule, even if it fires as designed. This is not a design flaw. It is a constraint of physics that every launch escape system in history has faced, from the Soviet Soyuz to the SpaceX Crew Dragon. The Soyuz system is the only one that has ever been used in a genuine crew emergency, successfully pulling 2 cosmonauts clear during a launch pad fire in September 1983. Every other system has existed as an insurance policy that the universe has not yet called in. The LAS tower itself is jettisoned from the Orion stack at approximately 3 minutes and 13 seconds into the flight. After jettison, there is no abort from explosion capability remaining. The crew is attached to the vehicle until orbit is achieved, or the vehicle ceases to be a vehicle. The solid rocket boosters, which cannot be shut down and which produced an anomalous actuator reading during Artemis I, burn through most of the period during which the LAS is most constrained. The overlap between the most stressful abort conditions, the unshuttable booster burn, and the unexplained hardware anomaly from the first flight forms a Venn diagram that NASA has not publicly addressed. NASA's Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, in its 2023 annual report, raised concerns about the pace at which the Artemis program was accepting open risks driven by schedule pressure. The NASA Office of Inspector General, in multiple reports between 2021 and 2024, identified patterns of risk acceptance within the program that echoed the language of post-Challenger and post-Columbia investigations. Every crewed rocket launch contains a window during which the crew cannot be saved. What NASA has not explained is how the anomalies discovered during Artemis I affect the precise shape and size of that window for the 4 people who will fly through it. Next. Number 2. The brain that restarted itself. Sometime during Artemis I's transit between Earth and the Moon, the Orion spacecraft's flight computer reset. It was not supposed to do that. Flight computers in crewed spacecraft are among the most carefully designed, most rigorously tested, most conservatively operated systems in all of engineering. They run on radiation-hardened processors precisely because the deep space environment will throw things at silicon that no terrestrial computer would ever encounter. The reset was logged, analyzed, and added to the growing list of post-flight findings that NASA's engineers began working through after December 2022. It was not the only time the computers behaved unexpectedly. Orion's flight computer system is built around the RAD750 processor, a radiation-hardened chip produced by BAE Systems and based on the PowerPC 750 architecture. The RAD750 is not new technology. It is a proven ruggedized chip that has flown on numerous spacecraft, chosen specifically because its behavior in radiation environments is well understood. During Artemis 1, the caution and warning system, the network of sensors and software that monitors spacecraft health and alerts the crew or ground team to problems, flagged multiple anomalies that required real-time troubleshooting from mission controllers on the ground. At one point, the spacecraft entered an unplanned safe mode, a protective state the onboard software initiates when it detects conditions outside normal parameters, which was not part of the mission profile, and which ground teams had to work through remotely. On an uncrewed vehicle, a safe mode event is serious but manageable. Mission controllers have time. They have communication access to every system on the spacecraft. They can uplink commands, review telemetry, consult with engineers across the program, and methodically work through a recovery procedure over hours if necessary. The spacecraft is not going anywhere it wasn't going to go anyway. The stakes, while real, are bounded by the absence of human lives aboard. On a crewed vehicle in deep space, the same event carries a different weight. Safe mode changes what the spacecraft is doing. It changes the crew's workload instantly. It demands an immediate response from astronauts who are simultaneously managing everything else a 10-day deep space mission involves. And it masks the system state that might reveal whether something more serious is developing underneath. NASA maintains as part of standard software configuration management practice what is known as a known issue register, a formal list of software and hardware behaviors that have been identified, reviewed, and accepted as risks, rather than corrected before the next flight. The existence of this register is not controversial. It is responsible engineering practice, acknowledging that no complex system achieves perfection before its deadline, and that not every known issue presents an unacceptable risk. The contents of the Artemis 2 known issue register, however, are not public. What carries over from Artemis 1 into the crewed flight, what the agency has decided to accept rather than fix, is information that NASA has not shared with the people who pay for the program, follow the mission, or love the 4 astronauts who will be flying it. A flight computer failure in deep space does not announce itself with a single, isolated symptom. It cascades. A reset during a critical burn window affects propulsion. A safe mode event during a navigation maneuver affects trajectory. A caution and warning system anomaly during a life support fluctuation could mask one serious problem with another. The flight computer is not one system among many. It is the central nervous system of everything else on this list. The heat shield deployment commands, the atmospheric system, monitoring, the propulsion sequencing, the abort logic. When the brain of the Orion spacecraft restarts itself unexpectedly in deep space, the question is not just why it happened. The question is what it was doing in the moment it stopped, and whether the 4 people aboard will have the information they need to understand the answer before the consequences arrive. Number 1. The number NASA won't publish. Before Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen were ever assigned to Artemis 2, before the mission patch was designed, and the training schedules were built and the press releases were written, a calculation was made. It is called a probabilistic risk assessment, and NASA is required by its own safety framework to conduct one for every crewed mission. The PRA is not a guess, and it is not a hope. It is a systematic mathematical process that takes every known failure mode, every component reliability figure, every mission phase risk, and every interaction between systems, and compresses them into a single number, the statistical probability that the crew will not return. NASA has calculated that number for Artemis 2. NASA has not told anyone what it is. The history of that number in American spaceflight is a history written in catastrophe. Before the Challenger disaster in January 1986, NASA managers had informally wrongly estimated the probability of space shuttle loss at something approaching 1 in 100,000. Physicist Richard Feynman, serving on the Rogers Commission that investigated the accident, famously calculated a probability closer to 1 in 100 based on engineering reality rather than managerial optimism. After Challenger, after Columbia, after 2 vehicles and 14 astronauts, the agency rebuilt its risk culture around honesty about probability. By the end of the shuttle program, NASA's own analysis placed loss of crew probability at roughly 1 in 90 per flight. The number had not changed as much as the willingness to acknowledge it. What had changed was the culture that looked at the real number and decided to fly anyway without telling anyone what it was. NASA's Office of Inspector General produced multiple reports between 2021 and 2024, raising concerns about the Artemis program's approach to risk acceptance. The language in those reports carries specific weight for anyone who has read the post-Challenger and post-Columbia investigation documents. Phrases like schedule-driven decisions, accepted open risks, and inadequate visibility into risk posture do not appear in OIG reports by accident. They appear because investigators found patterns that match patterns they recognized from the history they were paid to prevent from repeating. The NASA Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel's 2023 annual report expressed similar concerns, noting the pace at which unresolved technical questions were being carried forward into program milestones. The 10 problems in this video are not rumors. They are documented in post-flight reviews, Inspector General reports, aerospace trade publications, official program briefings, and NASA's own public communications. The heat shield erosion that nobody predicted, the atmospheric system anomaly that hasn't been fully explained, the 30 minutes of silence on the far side of the moon, the radiation environment that the spacecraft cannot fully shield against, the engine with no backup, the suit with open pressurization questions, the rocket that cannot be stopped in its first 2 minutes, the abort system with a physical limit, the flight computer that restarted itself in deep space. Each of these problems has a probability attached to it. Each of those probabilities feeds into the overall risk calculation. All of them together produce a number that describes how likely it is that this mission ends the way everyone hopes it will. There is a number that describes the probability that Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen will not come home from Artemis 2. NASA has calculated it. NASA has not published it. Inside that number lives every anomaly from Artemis 1 that was accepted rather than resolved, every open question that was carried forward to meet a deadline, every risk that was acknowledged and then approved by people who will not be sitting in the capsule. The 4 astronauts who will fly this mission know the risks, accepted them with open eyes, and deserve every measure of courage that entails. What they cannot control, and what the public cannot evaluate, is whether the agency asking them to take those risks is being fully honest with them and with itself about exactly how large those risks are. NASA has been to this place before. It did not end well. It never does. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.